Amen. I have spent the last, I don't know how many weeks, since Christmas, with kind of a theme in mind. If I were a different kind of preacher, I'd call them a sermon series, but that kind of marketing just doesn't jive with me, if you get it. But the theme has been, over the last few weeks, the humanity of Jesus. Like Jesus really encountering humanity, whether it's inside of himself or with the disciples, how human these stories really get to be. The idea being like how close Jesus really is to us, how close God really is to us. And then when you hear this story, this is the last Sunday before Lent begins, the proportions kind of shifts if you were listening to this story. You go from a kind of a human Jesus and the human stories to the transfiguration up on a mountain. And his face shone like the sun. And his clothes become dazzling white. Like, I can't get over this. I always think of it as Jesus is doing his disco ball impression. And Elijah and Moses, like ghosts, standing next to him, and a cloud, and the voice talking about him. You can feel the discrepancy of this doesn't feel human, this feels wild and a little bit of weird. Maybe a lot of weird. And suddenly, the whole thing about building shrines, temples, places of worship for each of these three, where is that coming from? And then having to walk down the hill together. The next verse that I didn't read is the messianic secret. Jesus says, oh, and by the way, don't tell anybody this happened. Like, you kidding me? This story, and to be fair, if you are going to a lectionary church, a church that follows the lectionary, and there's a whole thing on what that is, where seasons happen, the transfiguration, you've heard this story over the course of your life. If you do topical sermons, you might not touch it because it's a little weird. I want to say that even in this story of how godlike Jesus is, it still teaches us something incredibly enriching about humanity and God. If Jesus to you is nothing but a sage teacher, if Jesus to you is nothing about ethics and how to treat one another, then this story is ridiculous and hyperbole. I've encountered those kind of conversations. If you want to fit this story to the Greek-speaking world, this story was originally written in Greek and would have been understood in Greek. And if you have a bit more of a Greek worldview, you've actually heard stories like this. A transfiguration story is not something new to a first century Greek speaker. They've heard stories like this. Y'all who were here last week, you remember? How did you learn how to read and write Greek? Homeric epic. What is Homeric epic? They're making a movie about it. The Odyssey. Odysseus. Odysseus was transfigured before Telemachus. You remember that. He was transfigured, and it's about shedding fear and scaring the whole life out of Telemachus. That's the whole point of this. According to Ovid, Julius Caesar was transfigured. At the point of his death, he turned into a star and ascended to heaven. He was no longer human. Julius Caesar became a god at his transfiguration and was no longer touchable because he's up and away. Maybe names like Ovid and Telemachus, maybe even Julius Caesar maybe form, but maybe you've seen this Disney movie, Hercules. Hercules was transfigured when he finished his labors and scaled Mount Olympus. When he took his place among the gods, he was transfigured. Same kind of thing. His body becomes into a bursting light. He's shining forth. And it is said that he shed his human side. This pattern is familiar to the Greek-speaking world. A transfiguration was about becoming more than human because being human was something to be avoided. Now maybe, okay, so you're a Greek speaker, you've heard these stories. What if the writer of this and the first audience of this are deeply involved in the Jewish story? They're not necessarily Greeks. You got the folks who read and who have read or heard or been shaped and fashioned by the story of the pillars of their faith. And what frequently gets brought up with Moses and Elijah standing by Jesus is kind of a bifurcation of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. The law, represented by Moses, and the prophets, Elijah. It's classic. But one, you can say that both Moses and Elijah had a interesting death story. Moses, it is said that God himself, herself, theyselves, themselves, trying to be theologically appropriate. God is beyond all gender, and including all gender. God themselves buried Moses. So Moses didn't have a regular death. In fact, God came and took Moses. This is Jewish mysticism. Elijah, you ever hear the song Swing Low? Sweet Chariot? That's about Elijah, the fiery chariot. He doesn't experience death the way you and I do. God sends his own Uber to go get him. So if you have these two people whose bodies were never buried in the ground, you could have this like kind of mystical discussion about, well, it's appropriate for those two to be standing next to him. It's even better. This gets even better. Why? Why do we remember Moses? Well, he freed the people. But after that. It's the mountaintop. On the mountaintop, what was the experience Moses had? The burning bush. The burning bush. Who was in the burning bush? The voice of God. I am that I am. Where's the burning bush in this story? It's Jesus. Jesus is the expression of God here. And so having Moses stand with Jesus is a fulfillment of the Old Testament story. Elijah, what had happened with Elijah? Elijah demanded an audience with God. Where do you get the temerity to demand an audience with God? He demands an audience with God. The earth had an earthquake. There was an earthquake. And Elijah says, God wasn't in the earthquake. A great storm came rushing in. God wasn't in the storm. In fact, according to Elijah, God was in the still, small voice. So a still, small voice that spoke to Elijah now speaks in the presence of Jesus, saying, listen to him. I really hope that this kind of textual analysis helps add a little bit of depth and gravity to a story that could be written off as just Jesus being a disco ball. But if you enter into the story, let's take the story on its own merits. Be with Peter, James, and John. Go to this mountain. And if you are with one of them, you get to climb, you just finished this conversation. What happened before this is this whole conversation with Jesus about his death. Jesus insists that he has to die. And Peter's like, no, you don't. You've got the power of all these things. Why do you have to die? And Jesus says to him in the famous line, get thee behind me, Satan. Don't pull that line on an argument with a friend, let me tell you. The disciples have clearly misunderstood Jesus' mission, and Jesus is trying to get them on board to figure out why Jesus is in doing his ministry, that it's leading towards something. And as he leads them up the mountain, these three, why these three? Peter, James, and John, this is the inner circle of Jesus. There are 12 disciples, 12 apostles. Can you name any? I bet you can name Peter, James, and John. After that, can you name Thaddeus or Bartholomew? Those are just the ones I can kind of remember. You might remember Nathan, the good one. He's got the best joke in all the Bible. Ask me later. But you have this inner circle. Most of the stories of Jesus and the disciples frequently happen around Peter, James, and John. So these guys know each other. How on earth, when they look up and they see Jesus transfigured and they see Moses and Elijah, I'm going to be honest, did a lot of reading to try to figure this out, answer this question. How did Peter and James and John know it was Moses and Elijah? They didn't have, trading cards with accurate pictures. Were they wearing the name tags? Guessed? Like Old Testament prophet, you know me from the chariot story. I don't know. When the cloud comes down and the voice, from the whole thing about the prophet and the still small voice, that's kind of challenging. The first time I read this, the first time I'm reading this, when the still small voice comes out, I'm thinking of James Earl Jones. Big, booming, shaking the ground, this, And Peter wanting to build a shrine. This comment. This is honestly some of the heart of this story. It can make Peter kind of the target of a lot of preachers and disciples. Here he is, you're having this magical, mystical, otherworldly moment, and the first thing that crosses Peter's mind is, all right, let's keep it. I want to bottle it up. And you'll read some biblical scholars who are like, oh, it's about, he's going to make it a religious experience he can sell. That this can be a commodity. I don't know, man. I think Peter's reaction to build, or you could it's in Peter's religious understanding. As a Jew, shaped by Jewish story, the mountain was holy because of Moses. The Ark of the Covenant was the holy spot where God's presence was. The temple was the next spot where God's presence was. Maybe Peter is thinking, this mountain right here is the new spot where God's presence is. So I kind of want to cut him some slack. But even more so, I think his reaction is about as human as it gets. You have this holy, big, powerful experience. Maybe you want to bottle it for a little longer. How many readers do we got here? You get through 3/4 of a book that you just can't put down, and the dread starts to settle in. You're like, no, I want to stay in this world a little longer. How many parents, if you've actually been blessed with that moment of quiet, if you've had a screaming baby your whole day, and then you get that sweet 15 minutes of the child on your chest, asleep, and you're like, just hold it. Or the brand new baby smell. Come on, man. I'm feeling it. Big moments in life that you just wish to bottle. I tell every premarital counseling when they're planning their wedding, schedule in the day a time where it's just you two. The day is going to fly by. There will be no time for reflection. You got to schedule some time for you together. I know this because I got to do it for my own wedding. When we got done with our ceremony, big church ceremony, and it was all just blazing music, and we limo across town to our event, and we did open buffet style for the reception, and we told everybody just go and eat. Like, we're not doing the plated anything. The only plated meal was for Bethany and I, and we had a private room. We would enter in later. And when we planned it, it was really romantic thinking about it, because we're like, oh, we're going to look in each other's eyes, and oh, we're just going to reflect on how great the service was, and the fact that the bishop preached our sermon, and that her uncle gave the blessing. And When we got there, we just stared at each other like, what happened? Like, breathe. And I don't think then we enter in, we have the entry music. I don't think we saw each other the rest of the night until we got back to the hotel. It was just, why? Because you're trying to capture the moment. I've been a pastor 16 years. I've done over 100 funerals. And those are another one of these moments. When it comes to grief, I will tell you, if you ever plan on giving someone you love's eulogy, write it out. And for those who take my advice, the hardest part is not getting started. That's nerves. The hardest part of giving a eulogy for someone you love is the last paragraph, because you can see the ending. And when that hits, and if you're not given the eulogy and you're still in the funeral, there's the other moment. This church isn't really built great for funerals, but when the casket is wheeled by you, it's like that last transition. And the desire to hold on to a moment really resonates. I don't think Peter's instinct to try to hold on to the mystical is foolish. I think it's deeply human. He glimpses glory, connection, and clarity, belovedness. And when we see that, we want to build traditions, institutions. We want something to bring us back to those holy moments, even for our own. To admire, to withhold. But the voice of God doesn't say, admire my son. It says, listen. Which means we are not meant to stay in those moments. We are given the holy moments of our lives, the moments that truly change and transform us, so that we might trust that we are loved when we return from the mountaintop. We can say this even as you're in a United Methodist church right now. The United Methodist movement was founded by a guy. He was a priest, an Episcopalian priest, pastor, for 10 years. 10 years. When he had his strangely warmed heart moment. He was sitting in church. He heard Martin Luther's reflection on the book of Romans. And he writes, for the first time in my life, I felt like Jesus loved me. He was a pastor for 10 years. And it was in that moment he suddenly felt like a Christian in whole, not in part. And based off that experience, all of this has happened. That is what compelled the United Methodist movement. Not one shrine, but a movement of people. All is to say that this transfiguration of Jesus, your transfiguration moments, the moments of holy, they're not for Jesus, they're for you. And here is the scandal of grace. The same voice that thunders over Jesus whispers over you. Not when you have conquered your addictions, not when you have cleaned up your mess, not when your prayer life is finally impressive, but now. Right now in your fragile, unfinished humanity. The transfiguration is not God's escape from flesh. It is God's embrace of it. The dazzling Christ is the carpenter's son from Nazareth. He is not ashamed to call you brother, you sister, you my relative, my sibling in Christ. So when the light fades, when the dazzling moments aren't as dazzling because time has a way of padding our experience, or when fear begins to rise, remember what happens next in this story. Jesus does not condemn his disciples for fear. He does not lecture them. Jesus does not shame them for their terror. Jesus reaches out and touches them and says, "Do not be afraid." The glory of God kneels into the dust and places a human hand on our trembling shoulders. You are loved. You are loved in your own skin, in your own story, in your own stumbling. And you, disciples of Jesus Christ, members of Spirit of Hope, family and friends, you have seen the light of Christ for yourselves. You who have seen this light are now called to follow that voice and join in his song. With that, would you stand as you're able, and we'll join in our hymn.